All right, so just like with last week, what I'm gonna do is we're gonna create a demand curve using the willingness to pay for different consumers. So we're gonna map that to a demand schedule and then to a demand curve, and then I'm gonna show you what it means to have a consumer surplus for those individuals. And then I'm gonna formally define consumer surplus, and then we're gonna talk a lot more about it. You'll see a couple more examples. Yeah, let's run to it. So consider where the demand curve comes from. So for example, there are 4 consumers, Danny, Keith, Mike, and Neil. These are famous drummers if you can figure that out. Each one wants exactly 1 drum kit, but they have different willingness to pays. So I'm going to bring this chart over. So we're going to have Danny, Keith, Mike, and Neil. Okay, and then I'm going to say drum kit, willingness to pay. Okay. So Danny's willing to pay $2,000. Keith, $1,500. Okay, Mike for $1,000. And Neil for $500. Yeah. All right. So we want to write the demand schedule and draw the demand curve. Okay. So now I want to do price on the y-axis, and I want quantity demanded on the x-axis. I just basically going to do the price points 0, 500. We can say 1. Let's do this. 0 to 499. Let's do 500 even, in fact. 0 to 500. 501 to 1,000. And then we're going to do 1,001 to 1,500. And then 1,501 to 2,000. Okay. So these willingness to pays here, they're all given. I spoke to Neil. He said, oh man, I really want a drum kit, but I'm not willing to pay more than $500 for a drum kit, which is ironic because if you know who that drummer is, he actually has probably the most expensive drum kit in the world. Anyway, so we know the prices here. Okay. So for a price of 0 to 500, who's willing to pay for a drum kit? Okay. Is Danny willing to pay for a drum kit? Yes, Danny's willing to pay up to $2,000. So he'd be more than happy to pay $500. So you have at least one. What about Keith? What about Mike? What about Neil? They're all willing to pay. So 4. All 4 individuals are willing to pay for a drum kit. When it goes over $500, Neil is now no longer willing to pay for a drum kit. The other 3 are. When it goes over $1,000, Mike is no longer willing to pay. And then up until 2,000, and then greater than 2,000. Okay. And then for the sake of Excel, I'm just going to make it even numbers here. And then so you'll see. So this is just so that I can graph it on Excel pretty easily. It really should be like this. So I want to graph a scatter plot. So the first thing you should notice is what's on the x-axis and what's on the y-axis, which I have not labeled yet. So on the x-axis, what should it be? It should be quantity. And specifically, it should be quantity demanded of drums. Okay. And this P can go away because this is, we can say quantity, or say demand. You can label this graph demand for drums. Okay, but we definitely don't want this just to be P. Now we want the axis title, the primary vertical, to be what? We want it to be price. Okay. So price and demand, quantity demand, that are going to be functions of each other. Now, because there's only 4 people in this economy, and because they're only buying 1 unit, like one drum kit per, this graph is not going to be like a connected line like this. So I'm hesitant to draw a line over it. What I really want to do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this to the PowerPoint and show you what the demand curve should look like. This is one of the things where this is another like casualty of the distance learning course, is that I would usually do this right on the whiteboard, but I cannot. So you'll be seeing things graphed in Excel, which is pretty unfortunate. Okay, so from 2001, at 2001, the quantity should be 0, but from exactly 2000 to anything, exactly. So at exactly 2000, the quantity will be 1. If price drops to 1500, then quantity will go to 2. Price drops to 1000, quantity will be 3. Price drops to 500, quantity will be 4. And then anything after 4. All right, so I just copied and pasted that graph into Excel. Okay, so just so you can see it for your notes later. But let's go back to the PowerPoint. So we drew the demand schedule. We did the demand curve. We drew the demand schedule. Just some points here. If the price is 2001, who buys? Nobody buys because it's higher than the highest willingness to pay, so nobody wants to pay 2001. What about at 1300? Well, it's higher than Mike and Neil's willingness to pay, so these guys aren't going to buy, but Keith and Danny would, so 2 people will buy at 1300, and you can see this on the graph. Okay, so at 2001, the demand is 0, and at 1300, demand should be 2. Okay. So this is just your demand curve, and the reason it takes this like stair-stepping form is just I chose that because there's only 4 consumers, and you're not going to see this a whole lot, if ever. I'm not sure if I might test you on this, so keep that in mind. But in general, I probably won't test you on this, and maybe one question you'll get. But basically, this is just the demand function for 4 people consuming 1 good. And it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to smooth it out because it's not like at a price of $2,001 that 0.99 people are consuming. In this real world example, 0 people are consuming at $2,000.01. Okay. So that's just why I chose to make it stair-stepper. I'll let you know if I want you to do a stair-stepper versus smooth, but you can assume safely that it'll be smooth unless I say otherwise. It's just easier for what we're about to talk about in consumer surplus to do it stair-stepper. All right. So your individual consumer surplus basically is answering the question, how many dollars above the market price would each person have been willing to pay? Okay. So it represented mathematically, it's your individual consumer surplus is equal to your willingness to pay minus the actual price paid. Okay. And then we get to what's called the consumer surplus, or total consumer surplus, by summing them all up. So if I take this little stair stepper graph, I'm going to have to copy it back into PowerPoint. All right. So if I take this and I want to let's say in this example, so we know that market price is set by the combination of supply and demand, right? So presume that there's some sort of supply line here. Okay. You can even draw it in if it makes it easier. Okay, your supply. Okay. So this will be your market price. It'll be somewhere between 1,500 and 1,000. Okay, and that'll set your equilibrium. So in general, there'll be an equilibrium set by your supply and demand when they meet. Okay, in this case, equilibrium price, let's say EQ price equals 1250. Okay. So I'm just drawing a little line. All right, so I defined consumer surplus as being the difference between your willingness to pay and the price you pay. Okay. So we have 4 individuals here, each with their own individual willingness to pay. We had Danny, who's willing to pay $2,000. Okay, so yeah, move these bad boys down. All right, I'm going to add some lines here. All right, if price equals 1250. Okay. So let's do this. Consumer surplus okay, so if the price equals 1250, what's the consumer surplus? For Danny, he's getting the difference between 2,000 and 1250. Okay. So it'll be 2,000 minus 1250 equals 750. Okay, that's the difference between his willingness to pay and the price paid. So just as a reminder, consumer surplus equals willingness to pay minus, we'll call it the equilibrium price. Okay, what about for Keith? What's his willingness to pay? It's $1,500. What's the price he pays? $1,250. So his consumer surplus will be $250. Okay, what about Mike? Right? So Mike is over here. Mike's willing to pay $1,000. Is his consumer surplus negative 250? Well, no, that doesn't make sense. Mike isn't buying anything, right? So he's not getting some benefit. He's not getting utility above his price paid. Okay, he's not experiencing any gains from trade. So Mike's willingness to pay is 0. He's not getting any gains from trade. He's not getting any consumer surplus. Okay. Same thing with Neil. Neil would rather just not buy. Okay. So let's say if the price were $900. Oh, not 9,000. Okay. What's Danny's consumer surplus? It's 1,100. 2,000 is willingness to pay. do this. Let's even bold them so yeah, okay. Bold them so that they stand out a little bit. Okay. So if price is 900, Danny's willing to pay 2,000. Consumer surplus is willingness to pay minus price paid. So 2,000 minus 900 is 1,100. What's Keith's consumer surplus? It's 600. It'll be the 1,500 minus 900. For Mike, it's going to be 100. 1,000 minus 900. And for Neil, again, it's going to be 0. All right. So that is their consumer surpluses. And what if I asked for total consumer surplus? I'm going to put this in parentheses over here just so that you don't think it's part of the graph. It's just a reminder. But what's the total consumer surplus? It's going to be the addition of, it's going to be 750 plus 250. And that's going to be 1,000 when the price is 1,250. And then what about here? When the price is 900, it's going to be the sum of these three guys. So that'll be 1,800. 1,100 plus 600 plus 100 equals 1,800. All right, and then I'll give you guys one more. If price equals 1,000, say 1,000, yeah, let's just say 1,000. What will be the consumer surplus? Take a second, stop it. I'm not going to stop the video here. Just, give it a second and figure it out. You can pause it, actually. All right, so when hopefully you figured it out by now. So if the price is 1,000, Danny's willingness to pay is 2,000, so his consumer surplus is 1,000. Keith's is 500, 1,500 minus 1,000. Mike's is 0. He buys it, but he doesn't get any surplus because he doesn't get any gains from trade. Basically, this is the case where Mike could have made the drum kit for exactly what he's willing to pay. It's like his opportunity cost. And then Neil gets 0, so it'll be 1,500. That's the consumer surplus when the price is 1,000. One thing to note, as the price drops, so as it went from 1,250 to 1,000 to 1,800, notice the consumer surplus increased for each individual and on total. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot these again. So it was 1,000 was one equilibrium price. Plot S2. EQ equilibrium price star equals 1,000. Ugh, sorry guys, I'm not a great drawer, particularly I'm pretty bad in person too, but particularly here I'm bad as well. All right, and then equilibrium price of 900 would be, the supply curve was over here. S3 EQP star 900. All right, I'll clean that up when I copy it into the notes. But basically, we have three demand shifts here, or sorry, rather three supply shifts here that affect the equilibrium price. And we can see as the equilibrium price decreases, total consumer surplus increased. The reason being is total consumer surplus is the difference between your willingness to pay and your price paid. So if your willingness to pay stays the same, which it should, and the price paid decreases, then your total consumer surplus will increase. All right. All right, so I just showed that, sorry, I just put it into the notes. I just showed that as you lower the price, basically the consumer surplus increase, because consumer surplus is your willingness to pay minus the price, right? So it increases for the individual, it increases for the total consumer surplus. Not just because the price is decreasing, but because there's more people buying. So like going from here to here, you picked up, what's his name, Mike's consumer surplus, whereas here it didn't have it. It was just Neil and Danny's consumer surplus, or Keith and Danny's consumer surplus, I'm sorry. So as we moved from S to S2 to S3, the price dropped. You had an increase in consumer surplus for the individual, and then you might pick up a new individual who has also consumer surplus. Notice another thing. If you're to take 2,000 minus 1,250, notice it's directly here on the graph. 2,000's here, 1,250's here, right? So if I drew a straight line from the equilibrium price to the y-axis, and I filled this line in, I'd have one individual's consumer surplus. And if I took the second guy's consumer surplus, his willingness to pay minus the price, that would be right here. The third guy's willingness to pay minus consumer surplus is right here. So if this is 1,250, and you know that this willingness to pay is 1,500, I got 250 right here, and then I misspoke earlier. This is at 0. But this guy over here, his is 2,000. 2,000 minus 1,250, 750. So I have 750 plus 250. So 1,000. What does that look like? 750 plus 2,000. 250 equals 1,000 right here. What about here? It'd be the equilibrium price is 1,000. So I have 1,500 minus 1,000 plus 2,000 minus 1,000. Okay, so I'm just looking off this graph here. So 2,000 minus 1,000 is 1,000. 1,500 minus 1,000 is 500. So I should have 1,000 plus 500, 1,500. If I do the same thing here for S3, where the equilibrium price is now 900, I have 3 points here. I have this guy who's willing to pay 2,000, pays 900, so that's 1,100. This guy is 1,500. Minus 900, that's 6. And this guy is 1,000 minus 900, that's 1. So 100 plus 600 plus 1,100, 1,800, that's exactly what I had up here, like the tequila. But if you look, like if you're paying close attention, you notice, oh, the consumer surplus is the difference between the willingness to pay, which is given by the demand curve, and the price paid. That's the definition, the willingness to pay minus the price paid. And if you have enough people, enough of a demand curve, like instead of it being like a stair stepper, if it was a continuous demand curve where you have 1,000 people buying drums, and this is like 999.2 or something like that, and you were to draw each individual and each decimal of an individual's consumer surplus, you would get that the area under the demand curve but above the equilibrium price is your total consumer surplus. Okay, it's much easier to show in person, and I'm sorry. I'm really sorry that I can't. Okay. So I'm going to skip these next 2 bullet points because we just did it for 3 examples, but if you want to do it at home, do one with 1,300 as the market price, and you'll get these answers. So total consumer surplus should be 900. Okay. So like I said, how do we generalize this when there are many consumers? So when there are many consumers, your demand curve isn't going to be like a stair stepper. It's going to be a straight line. And what goes on the y-axis? what goes on the y-axis? Price. What goes on the x-axis? Quantity. Okay. And our demand curve should be downward sloping demand, like the downward facing dog. Okay. And if I were to draw the equilibrium price, so let's say I had supply here, which would be upward facing. The equilibrium price is going to be this little P star where the supply and the demand intersect. Okay. And if I had individuals, and each individual had their consumer surplus, this individual, with his willingness to pay minus the price paid, will be his consumer surplus. Oh, sorry. And if this individual, his willingness to pay minus the price paid, will be his consumer surplus. And this one. So like the stair stepper, but imagine that I could do this for every fraction of an individual. Look how it becomes just the area right here. And I'm kind of drawing a little bit over because I'm not good at drawing. But it's just the area. This area is the consumer surplus. Okay. With enough people, such that it's not a stair stepper, with a smooth demand curve, basically with a line when your demand curve is a line, or it's like a function like P equals MQ plus B, then your consumer surplus will just be the area between your demand curve and the price paid, because consumer surplus is equal to willingness to pay minus your price paid at equilibrium P star. Okay, that should be a star. Sorry that I'm drawing so poorly. All right, that's good enough. So your willingness to pay minus your price paid is your consumer surplus. And since the demand curve tracks willingness to pay, then the difference will be an individual's consumer surplus. And if you have continuous demand, then the total consumer surplus will be the area of the triangle. Okay. It's the area between your demand curve and your market price. As price rises, the area shrinks. As price falls, the area increases. Okay. So just to show you, let's say I had a supply shift to S prime. Why might there be a supply shift to S prime? As a quick recap, you could have an input price decrease. You could have technology progressions. You could have more suppliers in the market, and an increase in the population of the market, and increase in the number of producers. Right. But if the price drops, oh boy, take a look at this area now. It's bigger. Your new consumer surplus is this big old bigger triangle, which is bigger than the prior consumer surplus, the green one. Okay, so you have an increased consumer surplus because the willingness to pay minus price differential has changed. You also have an increased consumer surplus because more people are getting the difference between willingness to pay and price, right? The quantity consumed is increased. Okay, so because there's a different lower price, will increase consumer surplus, and also increase quantity such that the people buying the good and getting some surplus, that will also increase consumer surplus. So it's like a double impact. Okay. All right, so just to finish off, I have a much cleaner graph. So this will be a little bit easier to see, I'm hoping. So I always try to do my hand-drawn graphs and then have a clean graph after the end. Okay. So when price is P bar, this P bar over here. The consumer surplus is the total yellow triangle. If the price goes up to A, okay, then only, where's my mouse guy? Then only this top triangle is consumer surplus. Okay. So you lose, if the price went down and the same number of people consumed, right, the willingness to pay minus consumer surplus would be this guy, or willingness to pay minus price. But you also have additional consumers who add to the consumer surplus here. Okay. So like I said, it's a twofold effect. This first triangle is your new consumer surplus. This one is the people who still consume have lost consumer surplus because prices increased. And this is here, people who have left the market because prices increased are now not getting any consumer surplus.